She arrived in New York City with a suitcase, a sociology degree from a Midwestern university, and a name that nobody in Manhattan had ever heard of. Jane Smith from Kirksville, Missouri, who would later legally become Carolyn Roehm, had exactly $300 in her checking account and an obsession with beautiful things so acute it bordered on clinical. Within 15 years, she had married Henry Kravis, the architect of the largest leveraged buyout in the history of American capitalism. She was hosting dinners for heads of state, commanding 7-digit budgets for a single weekend party in the Austrian countryside, and running her own fashion label from a glass tower above 7th Avenue. Then Henry Kravis replaced her. Not with obscurity, not with failure. He replaced her with Marie-Josée Drouin, an economist, an intellectual. And he did it with the surgical coldness of a man who had spent his career dismantling companies and extracting their value. Carolyn Roehm lost her husband, her fashion house, her social standing, and her credit line in the span of 18 months. What she built over the next 30 years, entirely alone, is the part of the story nobody talks. Carolyn Roehm is one of the most consequential figures in American social history that most people cannot name. Today we are going to change that. Before we start, if this kind of story pulls you in, the kind that feels almost unbelievable until you realize it isn't, then you'll want to stay close to this channel. We are trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this month, and the people who subscribe early are the ones who end up shaping what this becomes. And one more thing, don't just watch this silently. Tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or your country in the comments. I read them, and it's the only way I get to see who's really on the other side of the screen. Now, let us go back to Kirksville, Missouri, in 1953, and meet a little girl with very expensive taste. The seed of ambition. Jane Smith's family occupied that particular stratum of the American Midwest that sociologists would describe as comfortable without being aspirational. Her father worked in agriculture. Her mother maintained a decent, orderly house. The family ate well, dressed practically, and expected their daughter to do the same. Jane had other ideas. From an age so early it astonished her parents, she demonstrated an understanding of beauty that exceeded anything her environment could explain. At 9 years old, she took money she had saved from small household chores and spent it entirely on a bolt of deep crimson fabric she had spotted in a dry goods store window. She did not sew the fabric into anything useful. She draped it over her bedroom furniture and studied the way it fell. Her mother found this bewildering. Her father found it impractical. Jane found it necessary. This was not precocity in the conventional sense. It was not the charming artistic sensitivity adults romanticize in children. It was something more structural, an almost compulsive need to impose order and beauty on whatever space she occupied. She redesigned her bedroom 3 times between the ages of 10 and 14, using only objects she found or made. She taught herself to identify the difference between quality fabric and inferior fabric by touch alone before she had ever set foot in a city with a department store worth the name. She enrolled at Washington University in St. Louis and studied sociology, a choice that would later prove more useful than anyone anticipated. Because what sociology teaches, at its core, is how social hierarchies are constructed, how they are maintained, and, crucially, how they can be penetrated. Jane Smith graduated understanding exactly how power operated in rooms she had never been allowed to enter. She packed her bags for New York. The calculated ascent. Manhattan in the mid-1970s was a city in financial collapse. Garbage on the streets, crime in the parks, businesses fleeing for the suburbs. But the fashion industry was not merely surviving. It was consolidating power. The great houses were absorbing talent at a speed that created, for those willing to accept almost any entry point, a genuine path upward. Jane Smith found her entry point through Oscar de la Renta. She did not arrive as a celebrated hire. She arrived as someone willing to do the work that more polished candidates considered beneath them. She learned pattern cutting. She learned the economics of a sample room, how fabric costs translate into retail margins, how a single bad collection can erase a decade of goodwill, how the relationship between a designer and their manufacturer is more intimate and more fragile than any marriage. She worked hours that would have destroyed women with other options. And she watched. She watched how de la Renta moved through a room. She watched how his wife, Françoise, curated their social circle, who was invited, who was seated where, how a dinner party could function as a business instrument. She absorbed the unspoken grammar of elite New York in the same way she had once absorbed the grammar of quality fabric, by handling it constantly until the distinctions became automatic. She also, with quiet deliberation, reinvented herself. Jane Smith became Carolyn Roehm, a name that carried no geographical history, no Midwestern associations, no traceable point of origin. It was, in the social mathematics of New York at that time, an almost perfectly neutral name. It announced nothing except arrival. By the early 1980s, she had been promoted to senior design roles and had accumulated something more valuable than a title. She had accumulated proximity. She knew the right people. She attended the right events. She understood the right rules. These were not the achievements of luck. They were the product of 7 years of calculated, disciplined accumulation. The foundation she built in those years was real. It was also, as it happened, not enough. The compromise. Henry Kravis entered Carolyn Roehm's life in 1984. He was, at that moment, in the process of becoming one of the most powerful financiers in American history. Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, the private equity firm he co-founded, had already executed a series of leveraged buyouts that were rewriting the rules of corporate acquisition. His personal fortune was measured in hundreds of millions. His social ambitions were, at that point, somewhat underdeveloped. Carolyn Roehm was the solution to that specific problem. They married in 1985. The union was, by any honest analysis, a mutual transaction. Kravis required a partner who could translate financial power into social legitimacy. Someone who understood the difference between spending money and deploying it with cultural intelligence. Roehm required the financial infrastructure to build something of her own. They were, in the language of the milieu they were entering, a strategic alliance. What followed was the most exhausting success in New York social history. Their social calendar operated less like a schedule and more like a permanent military campaign. They hosted at their Manhattan apartment, their Connecticut estate, their Austrian hunting lodge. Their guest lists read like a geopolitical index. Politicians, industrialists, heads of European noble houses, American media proprietors. Carolyn Roehm managed every detail: the flowers, the menus, the seating arrangements, the tablecloths, the lighting. She was simultaneously the creative director of their social life and the operational logistics officer who executed it. In 1985, she launched her own fashion label under her name, bankrolled in part by the financial resources the marriage made available. The label produced clothes of genuine quality, structured, feminine, expensive in a way that was American rather than European, which was precisely the gap she was targeting. Her shows attracted serious coverage. Her client list was populated with women whose names appeared on museum donor walls and charity gala programs. She was, by every visible measure, at the apex. But the apex had a fundamental structural flaw, one that anyone examining the architecture clearly could have identified. Every element of Carolyn Roehm's power, her fashion house, her social position, her credit, her access, was downstream of a single relationship. Remove Henry Kravis from the equation, and the entire system did not merely weaken. It ceased to function. This is not a criticism of Carolyn Roehm's choices. It is a description of the trap that the social world of high-finance New York in the 1980s built specifically for women who married into it. The ceiling was high. The exits were locked. By 1990, the first hairline fractures were visible. By 1991, the structure was coming apart. The fall. The public story of the Kravis-Roehm divorce, when it emerged in 1993, was told in the press as a romantic narrative. The powerful man, the glamorous wife, the inevitable dissolution. This framing was almost entirely wrong. What actually happened was not romantic. It was transactional, cold, and executed with the same methodology Henry Kravis applied to corporate restructurings. The marriage had been deteriorating for several years before the formal separation. The fashion label, which had never fully escaped its dependence on the financial backing the marriage provided, had accumulated significant losses. The business had struggled to attract outside investment, a problem that, when discussed quietly in industry circles, was attributed to a perception that Roehm's enterprise was Kravis's hobby rather than a freestanding commercial entity. Whether or not this characterization was fair, and many argued it was not, it was functionally lethal. The label could not refinance on its own terms. When the divorce proceeded, the social calculus was immediate and merciless. In the world that Carolyn Roehm had spent 17 years entering, the world of New York's financial and social elite, loyalty was not a moral virtue. It was a function of utility. The moment Henry Kravis's resources and social centrality were no longer available to her, the invitations contracted. The phone calls became less frequent. The seating arrangements at other people's dinners shifted her toward the periphery. This is not a story about cruelty, precisely. It is a story about the way elite social ecosystems function. The people who withdrew were not performing calculated unkindness. They were simply recalibrating around the new structure of power. Carolyn Roehm had been, for a decade, an important node in a network that Henry Kravis anchored. When Kravis exited, the network did not collapse. It simply reorganized itself around him and his new partner. Roehm was left outside it. The fashion label closed. The Manhattan apartment she had decorated with such obsessive precision was part of the settlement negotiations. Her credit facilities, which had been underwritten by the marriage's financial structure, disappeared with the marriage. She was 50 years old, extraordinarily accomplished, highly visible, and by the standards of the world she had operated in, entirely without infrastructure. The press, for the most part, covered this as a cautionary tale about a woman who had overreached. The subtext of much of the coverage was that she had confused access to power with the possession of it, that she had mistaken being adjacent to Henry Kravis for being powerful in her own right. This interpretation was both partially true and profoundly unfair. It was partially true in the narrow sense that the legal and financial structure of her position had been catastrophically dependent on the marriage. It was profoundly unfair in the broader sense that the same dependence was built into the architecture of the world she had entered, a world that rewarded women who performed exactly the role Carolyn Roehm had performed, and then penalized them for having done so. She left New York. The ashes and the rebirth. What Carolyn Roehm did next was not, on its surface, dramatic. She moved to a farm in Connecticut that she already owned, a property that had been hers through the settlement, modest by the standards of the life she had been living, but real and unencumbered. She began gardening. This requires a moment to understand properly. When Carolyn Roehm had been the co-anchor of one of New York's most powerful social households, gardening was something that happened on her properties, executed by professionals, managed at a remove. Now she was in the dirt herself, learning the actual biology of what she had previously only arranged in vases. She studied horticulture with the same systematic intensity she had once brought to pattern cutting at De La Renta. She spent hours in the Connecticut cold identifying soil compositions, understanding drainage, learning which varieties of flower would survive which conditions. The contrast with her previous life was not lost on her. She wrote about it later with a clarity that was striking precisely because it was free of self-pity. The first time she had arrived somewhere from scratch, she had been 22, unknown, and risking only her own nascent career. Now she was in her early 50s, recognizable to anyone who read the society pages of any American newspaper for the past decade, and risking something considerably more fundamental. The question of whether she had any identity independent of the world that had discarded her. She answered that question methodically and without audience. Over the following years, she became a serious authority on the aesthetics of the domestic environment, not in the glossy, event-driven way she had managed the Kravis household, but in a deeply studied, practical way that had nothing to do with access to a billionaire's credit lines. She began writing books, not memoirs. She was consistent about avoiding the revenge narrative format that publishers suggested. She wrote books about flowers, about entertaining, about the art of creating beautiful spaces with whatever materials were actually at hand. The books sold. They sold because they were genuinely useful, beautifully produced, and written by someone who clearly understood their subject from the inside. She built a brand that belonged, for the first time in her adult life, entirely to her. No investor who had to be courted. No husband whose resources underwrote the enterprise. No social network whose goodwill was required for the next season's collection to reach its audience. The farm in Connecticut became a genuine creative center. She designed, she planted, she wrote, she photographed. She collaborated with craftspeople and local growers. She created, on a fraction of the budget she had previously considered minimal, a life of extraordinary aesthetic richness. The philosophical payoff. Here is what the 1993 coverage of the Kravis-Roehm divorce missed entirely. Henry Kravis in 1985 needed Carolyn Roehm. He needed her social intelligence, her aesthetic authority, her ability to translate raw financial power into cultural legitimacy. The transaction was real, and it ran in both directions. Henry Kravis in 1993 had different requirements. He had already extracted what he needed from that particular partnership. He moved on. But Carolyn Roehm, the woman who had arrived in New York with a sociology degree and $300, who had spent 17 years learning the grammar of a world that would eventually exile her, had discovered, in the ashes of that exile, something that her former husband's considerable resources could not replicate. She had discovered that the only infrastructure that cannot be taken away is the one you build inside yourself. The life she rebuilt was quieter. It was also, by every meaningful measure, entirely hers. If Carolyn Roehm's story taught you anything today, let it be this. The most dangerous thing a system can do to you is make you believe its approval was the point. If this video made you think, made you feel, or made you see someone history forgot a little more clearly, subscribe. There are dozens more stories exactly like this one waiting for you. We'll see you in the next one.